Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for January 19th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we are joined by John Markley online. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
John, it's been a little while since you've joined us, so give us just a sentence or two about what type of work you do.
I've been with the company here for quite a long time and currently working in mobile endpoint security.
All right, very good. Glad to have you with us, and I understand we're going to be doing a little bit of a quiz later on. I'm looking forward to that, a little brain-racking activity. We have John Hogoboom here today. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Welcome
Glad to be back.
And Matt Kaiser, welcome.
Thanks, Brian.
All right, so let's get on with the program here. I'm Brian Rexroad, by the way, and Matt, we're going to go to you first. And I guess, you always want to be careful how much information you're sharing.
Well,
Take it.
It's information is one thing, but I think fully functioning malware code is a completely different story. So this one comes to us from Trend Micro. A researcher named Oktu Sen, I believe he's Turkish, released source code last year for a fully functional ransomware he's calling Hidden Tier, which is, interesting. Someone goes ahead and builds this and then decides for educational purposes to share it with the community and say, this is how someone would build something like this, potentially for malware analysts to say, how would you prevent something like this from working on a system, or how would you detect these sorts of behaviors? Mm-hmm. So, for those who don't have access to these kinds of samples, it could be valuable. Unfortunately, about a month later, someone found out that they were actually using this malware, not the original guy. Someone had downloaded the code, compiled it with a few small changes, and started using it in an actual ransomware campaign against people. So it really becomes an interesting question of what's more valuable? Is it more valuable to keep this kind of information sort of held close to the chest and share it with people who you trust, not to go out and use it for crime? Or is it more valuable to reach people who need the education, don't necessarily have access to those sorts of closed communities? Like, for example, if you're in high school or college and you want to learn about malware analysis, you're not going to have the hookups. You won't know somebody in the industry, most likely, who'll be able to get you into, say, a closed sharing community or access to some repository online. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually a little bit on the fence on this one. I'd like to hear what you guys have to think about it.
This reminds me of like a Chinese puzzle in reverse.
Okay.
It's one of these situations where you're trying to figure out what not to do, but still get the message across. So, one approach might be to, kind of do a demonstration thing, but have it be broken in a particular way, so that you'd have to really be kind of savvy in your approach to things in order to, like, you could have used like really crummy encryption or something like that. So if it did get used, at least there'd be a quick fix. You could just say, oh, well, just do this, and you'll be able to basically back channel your way out of it.
Or you could make it call home or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. So, there are little tricks that could be done along these lines. But I think ultimately, this actually reminds me of the first episode of iRobot, where there's this section where they're analyzing this thing, and he said, well, this piece of the code's really elegant, and this one's really chopped together. And he said, yeah, that part was something that my friend did. It was part of a demonstration, but it's those kinds of things. Ultimately we have to consider what the potential ramifications are of the work that we're doing. And I think in most cases where we've seen research papers that describe how things might be done are perhaps at least as powerful. And I think perhaps the purpose behind it, if you're really trying to educate folks on what things that need to be done, it kind of brings me again back to some of the things that Ed Amoroso was kind of sharing with us about, the higher order is protecting against it. Anybody can find a way to create an attack, figure out how to protect against that attack. So I think there are enough existence cases out there that you don't really need to create new ones to be able to demonstrate how you would go about protecting it against that type of thing. So final answer is use the existing cases. Why do you need to create new ones?
Yeah, I would agree also, because if you go to GitHub, you can get source code for most of these malware families, like the full source code, because there are other researchers out there who are sharing those samples up there with the actual real source code. So I think the only mistake here is that this guy kind of created something new of his own and put it out there for educational purposes versus things that are more mainstream. Like if you look at any of the point of sale malware you'll find all of the source code for all the various
Or even
versions.
Light Hydra,
Right, Light Hydra.
we know that
There's
one's
tons
on
of them
GitHub.
out there. So I think that
But I guess the question it's not really confined to, did this individual do something wrong? Did any of those guys who put the stuff up on GitHub for everyone to share, did they also commit the same sin?
I don't know. Like you said, I think it's going to be, nature finds a way. You know what I mean? There's going to be malware no matter what. And it's just a matter of how much. And if people are going to recompile and build slight variations of samples that are already out there, they'll probably get detected a lot more quickly anyway. So I don't know. That's my opinion.
It's a tough question. I mean, this is clearly there's not a clear answer. I mean, even among us. John, maybe you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that, if you look at a lot of I think you mentioned earlier is so these source codes that get published, they actually put an error in the code, or they don't give you the full code. I think that's a little better than publishing the full, disclosure, but a white paper probably would have just done just as well as releasing source code.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think we're sort of in general agreement. There's some fundamental issues around this. There may be some better ways to go about it. If the true purpose is education, I think the existence, the ones that already exist and have these characteristics, and if there are certain aspects of it that are, that you want to, sort of point out, that can be done in a verbal sense without providing the overall solution. I mean, it doesn't take it all the way down the path, at least. And really, the higher order here is to protect against them, as opposed to demonstrate how it can be done.
I think it's funny because the author did include a note saying this is for educational purposes, not to be used. But I remember, going on bulletin boards and other places and forums and reading, hacker docs, and they all say at the very beginning, this is just for educational purposes. You should never use this to attack, blah, 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 blah. And it's kind of boilerplate and after a while you start to say, there's no way you can really use what you're writing here to do anything but commit a crime. Or of course for research as well, but I don't know. It seems at some point some people will just use it because they know if they don't use it, they're going to get in trouble.
But also for people like us who are responsible for defending, knowing how this stuff works is helpful. So it is a complicated question.
Absolutely.
I don't know if there's a right answer. So necessarily not putting it out there is not necessarily the right answer, but because the people who are going to use it to help protect themselves are the ones you want to be able to read this kind of thing and understand it. So anyway.
So John, let's go to you here. And this is a case where it's not a case of malware, it's a case of a bug. And I when they first came out with this, I don't think it really has an official name. I have the tendency to want to call it bleeding heart because it's a little backwards from what we had experienced before. So.
And I kind of want to, I have a slide here that talks about this recent bug. So this bug is in OpenSSH, which is a little bit different, related to OpenSSL, but different. They share some common libraries, but it's really in the SSH client piece. And SSH is like a command line tool that you would use to connect from one machine to another at a console level, as opposed to like web browsers talking to each other, which would be the OpenSSL aspect. In any event, so in Heartbleed, which was an OpenSSL bug from 2014, what actually was happening in that case is I'm a web browser. I could go talk to a vulnerable web server and send some codes to it that would do some arbitrary information disclosure. I could see some of the data that was actually in the server. I could just keep poking it over and over again. In this case, it's a completely different thing. So that was a really bad bug, the Heartbleed one.
That was bad. I mean, because one of the things that could occur
It was so easy.
Well, the key could leak out as a part of that.
Right.
And that was a big deal, particularly if it was the server-side private key.
Right.
In which
Then
case
you
that
could
would
decode
potentially,
all the
basically, just makes the all of the encryption effectively ineffective.
Yes, exactly. But this recent bug is in OpenSSH, and it's only in the client piece. Right. So that is, you're running command line. You're going to SSH from one server to from one workstation to a server. It's in that client piece of code. And what is actually happening here is in your client, you go to connect to the server, and if the server is malicious, he can send information like some exploit code back to your client. And it's actually in the use roaming functions as part of the client. And it's only in the client. The server does not have a vulnerability in it. And via that, it can exploit the client to send its private key to the server.
But that's just a session private key.
Well, it would
Or is it
be,
the
no, it's the
authentication
private key.
key?
Yeah, so if you're using public-private key kind of
Right,
thing,
okay, so it's the authentication key.
for your authentication, so in SSH you can have password authentication or you can have a public-private key pair. So we'll send that to you,
Right.
or send it to the server. So the thing about this is, well, actually a couple of notes that I had here. So it's a bug in the use roaming option in SSH. It's been patched, so you should just apply the patch. If you can't apply the patch for some reason, you can disable that option in your client in the SSH config. The SSH client has to visit a malicious server and it has to authenticate successfully before the exploit can get sent from a malicious server to the client. So it's not like I can just coerce you to come visit my SSH server, and unless I can somehow authenticate you just on the fly, but I don't really know if that's going to be possible. And then even still, with a man in the middle, like if you've ever used SSH, if you're going to try to pretend to be an SSH server that somebody else is trying to get to, you're not going to have the same key pair on your side, your host key pair. So it's going to bring up this big warning message to the client, and the client's going to know, hey, this isn't the same server I logged into yesterday. Something's wrong here. So it's a little weird. They did mention one plausible scenario. So an advanced nation-state attacker who can compromise an SSH server that maybe has something interesting on there. Let's say they compromise it however means they go to do that. And they're on there. Then they make that server malicious and they start collecting private keys for all the users who log in, so that if someone figures out that this machine's been compromised and they fix it and clean it up, now they have all the private keys, and if the users don't change their private keys, they can regain access.
So it's persistence.
For persistence,
mechanism.
type of thing.
Well, that's actually a clever observation to
Right.
keep in mind in terms
Right.
of protecting against it. That is,
So-
if you find a compromised SSH server, you might want to consider, and that's potentially vulnerable to this. Have clients that are potentially vulnerable to. You might want to make sure that they reset their keys as a
Right.
part of the activity.
Right. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is there's a lot of people who use a very popular SSH client for Windows called PuTTY that is not impacted by this. It's really just the OpenSSH code branch. I guess it's maybe from FreeBSD. I'm not quite sure who, or OpenSSH.org.
Okay.
So you're not impacted if you're running PuTTY.
All right. So very good. Not anywhere near as significant as Heartbleed.
No,
Not the
very difficult to exploit in a meaningful way or repeatable way that a client would not notice.
Right.
So.
Well, and in terms of patching systems, generally I guess it depends on the operations environment, but you should keep systems up to date, patched. But in terms of criticality, if it's a server that you are logging into as opposed to logging, using as a launch point or using the client side or going to another system, if you're not using the client on that server, then it may not be any significant issue.
Right.
I assume this would apply to SCP as well, right?
Yes.
It's basically a copy
or
overlay onto
SFTP,
SSH. Or
right?
SFTP.
Any of those SSH, whatever other, they use the same protocol, underlying
It's a lot.
protocol.
They share a library. It's,
Right.
Yeah, it's a library issue. So whatever is shared with that library.
Right. So, all right. Well, good to know. It's good to keep that in mind. And like you said, most folks, I presume most folks that are using a client from Windows platform are using PuTTY, so not susceptible. But if you have a Linux platform or something you're using to log into other systems, you want to
You should,
take a look
you
at
should
the patch, or
update
at least-
anyway,
at
just to
least,
make sure you're
block
covered.
the use roaming feature.
Right.
All right, good deal. So let's go on to this next one here. And John, I guess, John Markley in this case, we talk a lot about fake sites, but I guess one of the things that I have to admit is not foremost in my mind is fake news.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we have here is Snopes did a pretty good review. It's a good article if you get a chance to read it, about the prevalence especially on social media, of fake news. And they go through a couple sites and a couple normal sources for that type of information. And they mentioned that a lot of people can't distinguish between the fake and the real. The challenge, of course, from a security perspective, is some of these sites actually lead to malicious content or have other challenges. So I recommend this site. I mean, it does talk a lot about clickbaiting and that type of thing. But it also really gives a good overview of why these sites with their fake news and why they exist and how they operate. So it's a good read, and not a whole lot of security content per se, but it is I think it is very relevant to what we see in the environment right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. User awareness, that is us as people, that what I've recently read is wetware. We need to be cognizant of the things that, truth versus fiction, and the things that we're looking at. It's the primary filter we have for identifying phishing attacks, and it's the same kind of thing we need to apply to news. There are all kinds of subtle lines between what is real, nonfiction and fiction. And so I think it's good to bring that up.
Well, and you get to thinking about, like the story kind of talks about how do you kind of tell it's fake. I always use the rule of thumb that if the article says, please share or like this, that leads me to think that it's probably not quite kosher.
Right.
Especially if you have to like or comment or favorite in order to view the article itself. Almost 100% of the time that's fake. It's just there to build more likes and get more attention for the same article.
That's true. Yeah. There have been it seems like a rash of things where they use these subtle little lines like, mourning this, celebrity or something along those lines, although it is actually true that Glenn Fry has passed away, but the Arnold Schwarzenegger has not yet. So.
Thank God.
Knocking on wood.
All right, thank you, John. Matt, we're going to go back over to you here, and so LostPass and LastPass. Let's get, we had to check and make sure that wasn't a spelling error. I had to check it, but tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So we know about the site LastPass, and it's a password manager website. You can store all your stuff up in the cloud. With a single password, you get access to the rest of your passwords. In general, password managers, I endorse them. I think they're a great idea because I personally can't remember all of mine. And having a single place to store them and access them that's still secure is a good idea.
I don't think there are very many humans, except perhaps the Rain Man, that could remember all their passwords, so long as they're doing good practices and using unique passwords at all of the different sites and tools that they use.
I knew one guy who was memorizing the digits of pi. He could probably do it, but I don't think anybody else could. So there's a ShmooCon this year.
That'd be a good password, by the way.
Which one?
Pi.
Pi?
Take forever to type it in.
Yeah, literally forever to type in, yes. So at ShmooCon, Sean Cassidy produced a tool he calls LostPass, which is, as in you're losing all your passwords, and this is exactly what it is. It's a phishing attack on LastPass. So the interesting thing about LastPass is that it resides in your browser as well as a website. And if for some reason you may lose connection to the site or you have to log back in, it'll drop down a little thing on whatever site you're visiting that says, by the way, you're not logged into LastPass right now, you need to change that. So Sean Cassidy's attack takes advantage of the fact that it shows up in the browser, and if you bring someone to a phishing site that you've prepared, it'll drop one of these things down and say, by the way, you got to log into LastPass. You click on that, it'll bring you to a fake LastPass login page. And typically, he sort of tailored it for using Chrome. So in Chrome, there's a certain thing where it's called Chrome extensions, where it'll load within the browser a certain type of content locally. But he registered chrome-extensions.pw, which is close enough to fool most people. As a part of that, he built this phishing page. When you put your username and password into it, it'll actually use the LastPass API to go and check your password for you. And if you're using two-factor authentication, and this is the part that's kind of impressive, it will go ahead and bring back the challenge portion of that and say, okay, you gotta type in your two-factor authentication, Google Authenticator, I think in this case, and then it'll ship that back to the site as well. And once it's collected all the necessary details to log you in, it steals all your passwords. So the vulnerability that this, it's sort of a weakness in the LastPass site itself. It's been fixed, and LastPass has actually gone the extra mile. And if you're using LastPass from a computer you've never used it from before, in which case maybe the attacker's computer will be making that same request. There's someone you've never logged in before as. It'll ask you for an extra factor of authentication as well.
All right. So that's a good deal. And I think that's one of the really, my impression at least, a valuable mechanism, that is to have some association with the end device that the user is coming from. That is that I think that's generally done with a cookie on websites, and
Typically, you have a session for that
Right.
you respond back with every time you talk to the site. Yeah.
right. So I think it's valuable to make a little distinction. We were talking about the ransomware case or the sample code. This is a case where somebody came out and described an exploit, but I think you mentioned a couple of key factors here that the problem has been fixed. I don't know if there was a public disclosure before the problem was fixed, but that's really the right process to go through, is to, if you find a problem, contact the organization that has the problem. Sometimes they have a bug bounty program, and take advantage of that. You might actually get paid for the finding, work with them to fix it, and then seek the glory of the finding. So in some cases you don't get the opportunity to do that if you participate in a bug bounty program, but that's a choice you get to make, money or fame.
Yeah,
Doesn't always come together.
I'll have to admit, I applaud LastPass for how quickly they got on top of this and addressed it. One thing that it does kind of ring in my head, and it's kind of been bugging me about a lot of websites I use that I wish more websites did, is whenever you log on to that website, there should be a way when I go to my account settings to see all the recent logons and what device did that. So if it was like a phone or an app that connected to it, and what that IP address was that connected, and just have an audit history of like the last, it could be just last 7 days, just so I know that nobody's gotten my password. I could log in and look and see that there haven't been any weird places that have logged into my account on whatever website that I'm checking on, especially with things like security camera things, or even like this, like LastPass, where you've got some really secure content in there that I want to know if anybody else logs into this thing besides my IP address or IP addresses that I know I normally would come from.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, because I found out more sites are providing notifications, but it's generally an email notification that goes right into the email account that we always talked about as sort of that key critical piece. If your email account's been compromised, it's been used to reset your password, the notification goes into that email account, and the attacker just deletes it. How do you? You have no control. But if you actually have the opportunity to go to a website and view the logs and say, you know what? Yeah, that was me, or this one wasn't me. It's it would be certainly a valuable thing
I only know of a few sites that actually do that. I won't name who the ones are, the good ones that do that, but there are a few that do. So
I think you can.
Yahoo
is
one.
Okay, there you go. There's no shame.
They're pretty good
There's
about
no shame in doing a
tracking
good
that
job.
and giving you the ability to look at it. So.
Right. Very good. So good story here. I think there are some good aspects of this. It's good to see that they've fixed this. One of the things that I guess we're going to go into sort of another authentication story here, John. So, but we'll do a little trade-off on, there's storing, and then there's a two-factor authentication, thing that we're going to talk about here. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, so this is another story. So we've talked about malware on phones, and malware that has recently been reported on phones that are specifically harvesting passwords, like one-time passwords, for various banking and other financial sites. So, the general process is maybe I'm logging into my banking website, I put my login ID and password in, and it says, we have this second factor of authentication. We're going to send you a PIN code that you have to type in. So we're going to send it to your phone. And a lot of times they'll offer it as either an SMS text message, where you get the PIN code in a message, or they'll even, I know a lot of them will do email, and then some others will actually do a voice call. So they have like kind of a robot calls your phone, and you pick it up and you listen, and it'll tell you the code that that you need to type in on the website. So this new piece of malware, I don't know if it's new or not, but a new variation or technique that this Android.Bankosy malware is doing is it actually has code paths in it, so that if there is this type of voice callback as part of the banking thing, it can go and forward the phone number silently to the user. So like, let's say I'm the bad guy, I want to go log into your bank account, and I have this malware on your phone. I could say, okay, for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to forward any phone calls that come to his phone to me. I'm going to try to log into the banking website, tell it to use the voice authentication. I get the call because it gets forwarded to me, and I put the code in, and I get through. So it's an interesting new technique that they're using. We know that they've been doing the one-time passwords to the SMS text messages, which is a lot easier to kind of harvest and then shuttle off to somewhere else. But this voice call interception is a little bit more advanced, or it's a different twist. I don't know if it's necessarily advanced.
Not something most people would be expecting.
Right.
So this malware app, I assume this is something where the end user gets bamboozled into loading onto the device. I remember a case, it was a classic one before, where they actually sent a message to the end user in advance, and they sent them a message that said, it purported to be from the bank, and said, we're going to ask you to install this thing as an security enhancement for your access to the banking site. And so, the person, oh, well, I got a warrant, and the next thing they get this message to load this piece of this app onto their device. That was one of the first cases that I'm aware of where they were trying to intercept SMS messages, and I think they purported it to be, part of the two-factor authentication mechanism. And so it gave basically the user of the queue that grant access to the SMS messages, which would go in and pilfer those. Right. It's the same kind of thing here, where once you get one of those malicious apps on there, it gets permission to be able to get access to other media like voice or SMS messages. It is able to get into that path, and I think that kind of gets to the point where I like to make a distinction between back-channel authentication and this is sort of two-factor authentication, but it's a weak form of it because that back channel is potentially accessible from other places due to things like call forwarding, being able to, and a lot of services allow you to get, messaging services from alternative places. You can install an app on your PC and get SMS messages, or you can, go to a website and get it. So to think of that messaging service as it only goes to a particular device and try to make an attachment that it's something you have and something kind of authentication just falls apart very quickly.
Do you think that two-factor auth should not just be a second message, that it should go to a separate second device? Because the assumption in this case is that, if the handset is compromised, no matter what comes into the handset, you have a chance of it being intercepted anyway. Should it go to, I don't know, maybe a backup email address or some other way, a second phone number?
Certainly an ideal way. You want to get some diversity in it, but I'm a little old school on the notion of two-factor authentication. It was always originally defined as something you have, physical, and something And it started out as little token things with the displays, and they also had things where you get a challenge and you type in a thing and it displays a response, you type in the response. There's automation that you can put around that, have basically a token chip built into computers. IBM did that years ago. It never really took off because nobody understood why it would be valuable. And I think in mobile devices there are some opportunities to bind things, even to have an app that is well enclosed, that doesn't get all these permissions from outside things. It's keyed specifically for the device. And I think where we'd like to see things going in the future is to really bind it to the SIM chip that's on devices, which is what's used for registering actually to the network. So there are a lot of opportunities here to improve it, but there really needs to be a strong binding, in my opinion, between something you have, and which means that it can't be done from another place, and something which is really some attribute that helps to control access to like if you lose the thing you have, it shouldn't be a free reign into whatever you have. So.
Well, we were talking before the show. Yeah. The RSA app for your phone, I'm pretty sure, is tied to the hardware ID of the phone. So if you get a new phone with a new hardware ID, you've got to go re-register
you got to register it, and it's going to
change
generate
it on the
different codes
system that you're trying to log into.
Yeah.
But it still doesn't insulate you from that device getting compromised, right? In theory,
if the device itself is compromised, yes.
like this malware, it's all bets are off.
You're
somebody
absolutely
could
right.
write something that pokes into the RSA app and watches the numbers that are getting generated on or something. I don't know how I would do that, but
you can take pictures of the screen and send it or something like that. So there are little tricks that could potentially be done. I just want to sort of emphasize, first of all, the back channel thing is better than nothing. That is, it's better than just a regular password. But we have to be cognizant of that there are other things, other means to get access to the back channel. So It's better, but not the end game. I think to your point, most of the cases that we've talked about, and almost all of the malware cases we've talked about on mobile devices, it hasn't been a compromise of the device, it's been installation of a malicious app.
Right.
And so what you're talking about really does require compromise of the device. And jailbroken devices are more susceptible to that type of thing. And it can still happen. There's still computers in the end, but
Right.
it's a
So
little
be
bit
careful.
better.
Don't sideload apps. Well,
Talk about that a
we
little
might,
bit.
we might have a trivia question about that later. But basically means install from the non-official app store for whatever your device is, like Google Play or the Apple Store. But also pay close attention to when you install apps, what permissions they're asking that they think they need. So if you're installing some new calculator app and it says, I need to access all of your SMS text messages, that's kind of like, why would they need to do that, So you should be questioning that when you install apps to make sure that what it's asking for really makes sense. And as long as if you avoid those third-party app stores, it should help you quite a bit from getting a piece of malware like that, especially on Android devices, I would think.
Very good. All right, so John Markley, let's go to you, and you've assembled some security trivia quiz questions here, and we're going to kind of, struggle through trying to answer some of these. So go ahead and shoot. What's the first one?
Sure. All right, so we're gonna really push you to the limits on this first one. so the question is: put the following worm/virus events in order from oldest to newest. And so A is Melissa, I love you, SQL Slammer, and Sasser. B is I love you, Melissa, Sasser, and SQL Slammer. C is Sasser, Melissa, SQL Slammer, and I love you. And D is SQL Slammer, Sassa, I love you, and Melissa. And there's an extra credit question here that's not listed, which is which one of these are worms and which one of these are viruses?
Okay. So I think I can help at the beginning here, but I think we really should give this question to Matt, because I think some of these date back to before Matt was born.
I don't think
That is not true. Although some of these happened when I was in middle school.
When you were in middle
I
school.
remember those.
I think I'd have a better memory then.
Yeah, because I've forgotten half of this.
I have a guess, but I'll
So
let
go
Matt
ahead
guess
and
first.
give us your little twist on this
So-
first. And I think it's probably worthwhile to describe a little bit. John had asked about which are viruses and which were worms.
And that's the easier question. I actually know those.
Yeah, I can.
So,
I think I do too.
Melissa and I Love You were both email-based, so those were viruses. You had to open up an attachment in order for those to run. SQL Slammer and Sasser were both worms.
Right.
They connected to the MS SQL port and, LSAS. I don't remember what port that was, right? But it was LSAS service?
I think you're right.
I think
Absolutely.
You're right.
Yeah.
It's either like
Yeah,
135
that was a
or
slammer
137 or 445, but I think it's,
All right, so now I have to see. This is the hard one.
Order it.
I'm impressed
man.
already.
All right. Can I get two of the answers taken away, or maybe phone a friend?
Well, I think I can help you take away a couple of them.
Okay.
Because actually, right around the corner behind me here, there is a chart on the wall that was really the impetus behind what ultimately we talk about in the Internet Weather Report. It was the original worm that really had an impact on the internet. So it was very notable. We have the graph of it basically around the corner there. Anna Moroso had it framed, and he had it in his office for a while. He's got it up on the wall over there. So this was really the sort of the starting point of the, there was the Morris worm before that, but it was the SQL Slammer worm that really slammed the internet. And it was very efficient. It only took 505 bytes, and that was the entire code set of the worm. You toss it at the SQL server on port 1434 UDP, and it would basically infect the device and send it out, spraying packets out to the internet, and infected a huge number of devices. So that was one that was clearly, in my mind, before Sasser, which one was the LSAS service that came later. It was still big, but nothing in terms of network traffic, comparatively speaking. So I think that helps you eliminate two of them.
That does, and I'm going to go with letter A. Melissa, I Love You, SQL Slammer, Sasser.
Okay.
So
What
how
do
did
you
I
think,
do?
John?
Well, I'll give you the answer. The answer is A. So Melissa, Melissa came out in 1999.
Nice.
The I Love You came out in 2000, and then we have SQL Slammer, which was 2003, and Sasser in 2004, four-ish. So I think Matt was alive during all these, but
All right, good job.
All right.
well, but I will tell you missed one, and it's obvious you guys don't have these questions, and you missed this area. Only one of those was a virus. All the rest of them were worms.
Oh, really?
So only Melissa was the virus.
I don't think that's true.
All right.
So we'll agree to disagree.
Look it up. It's the other ones did have worm behavior. So Melissa's the only one that didn't actually have the worm behavior.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
was
I'm
the
just
I
saying
love you
it's
one
probably
because-
a semantic question about what's a worm and what's a virus too, right?
Yeah, I think there's a subtlety there. I think it depends on how you define it. That is, the SQL Slammer and the Sasser worms, I tend to define them as worms because there was no
Yes.
action required upon the
But I
users
think
to
I
make
love
that.
you.
It
You
was a
didn't
network
need to either,
attack.
right? Because all you had to do is send an email to someone, and in their preview pane, as soon as they received it, it would actually execute. No.
It's what I'm seeing here from Wikipedia. You know, the source of all sources, always correct.
It's on the internet. So
It must be true.
correct.
So it was apparently an attachment. It was a VBS attachment.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I don't know that Outlook or whatever mail client you happen to use would have opened a VBS by itself.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm going to say that's a virus.
All right. Well, we're going to agree to disagree.
Well, I'm going to challenge
and then-
that. I could make a worm in less than 500 bytes with a
Less
port
than
that's
500
with a port that's going to appear on the top 10 chart today.
Interesting.
Are you scared
All
yet?
right. Was it
All right.
500?
So let's hit the easy question. Okay, and we've already kind of mentioned side loading. So side loading is A, the act of carrying a toddler on a hip. B, which is in honor of our recent holiday, the amount of overage due to eating too much turkey during holidays. C, installing apps onto a mobile device without using an official app store. And D, taking a shipment to a side entrance.
John knows this one.
Well, I actually already answered
Exactly.
this one, but okay, I'll take this one. We already discussed it.
This was supposed to be mine, but you blew it for me, John. Go ahead.
Well, I don't really have anything witty like Matt had to say to kind of dance around answers, like taking a shipment to a side entrance. But the actual answer is what we just discussed in the last article, installing apps onto a mobile device without using official app store, C.
All right. Here we go. Okay, so that was kind of a gimme. So I'm going to go ahead and take the lead on
Okay,
this
you're
one.
gonna take
since
the hard
John
one.
stole mine here. John Hogoboom stole
All
mine.
right, so let me give you the hard one. So, and I don't know if it's harder than the first one, but it's a little harder than the second one, obviously. Bluetooth data is transmitted through what means? Either A, magnetic, B, optical, C, radio frequency, D, capacitive coupling, E, laser, or F, induction.
Okay, so I think I'm going to start by ruling out magnetic, because one of the problems with, anytime you have an electric field, you also have a magnetic field. Does everybody know this rule?
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, but the problem is magnetism doesn't really propagate very far. Although Bluetooth is near field, but 30,
Not that
40
near.
feet, yeah, it's not that near. So optical is a neat one. There are some really cool optical communications things. In fact, I've seen some things where they are using them as potential alternatives to Wi-Fi, where you have a lot of potential for interference, but it requires that you have, basically transponders all over the ceilings in the rooms where you want to be able to use this type of thing, and it needs to be modulated. So I haven't seen too many Bluetooth devices with light coming out of it, or even infrared.
That's
Like
what
an
the little
infrared
blue LED
remote.
is for, Brian. Did you know that?
I'm sorry.
When you turn on Bluetooth, the little blue LED comes
the little
on.
blue
That's why
LED.
it's called
That's what it's
Bluetooth.
for.
No. See, I always thought that was a battery indicator. So I'm going to skip C for the moment because, well, we'll come back to it.
That's just implausible.
Capacitive coupling, that's a pretty cool idea, but,
I don't even know what is capacitive coupling.
well, there are actually some touch screens that use capacitive coupling that basically what they're doing is they're picking up
that's
on but that's a really, really near field detection. It is basically if you take a conductor, and we're
Right,
sort of
humans.
weak conductors, and you put an insulator and then have another conductor behind that, you can build up a charge.
Tap out Morse code. That would be your method to.
Yeah, in effect, yeah.
Bluetooth.
Or if you're transmitting to your
Communicate.
phone.
So, and then laser, that's really a form of optical, but it's very directional. So you'd have to be pointing directly at the thing. That would be very convenient. Induction, well, that's basically a type of magnetic field sharing. So I think we're going to have to go with radio frequency because most things are radio. In fact, I happen to know that Bluetooth uses 2.4 gigahertz as its frequency band, and which is a really cool frequency band, except that everybody's using it for everything. It's actually it's actually a little piece of spectrum that's considered unregulated. I think it had something to do with microwave ovens tended to use that frequency. I don't know this for a fact, but I think that may have been so they were concerned about frequency interference, and so they said, well, just leave it out for people to use whatever way. And then they started coming out with all these cool devices like cordless phones, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and then everything started interfering with each other, not the microwaves.
Yeah, especially
and
when
so
you're
now
trying to
they're
talk
creating,
on the phone and heat up your chicken in the microwave.
Yeah, now they're creating other bands to moving things up to 5 gigahertz for a lot of those things. So anyway, final answer, C.
And next time I'm going to have PhD level questions because you guys nailed it. So that's C, radio frequency is correct.
Okay. So, all right, so let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And, we had covered this last week. I just wanted to give a little bit of an update. Scan probes on port 11101 UDP. And, John, you had looked at this. This was related to some BitTorrent activity and had a really strange demographic.
I still don't have an
associated with
answer for why the sudden rise.
Yeah, well, we've seen this occur occasionally.
Ports, yeah.
I have this funny feeling that there are some controls that are being put into place to try to inhibit this stuff, and they kind of migrate to a different port and some things like that. That's just a little bit conjecture on my part. In any case, it says sources in the U.S. I took a look at it. It is P2P activity. It's file sharing activity. It looked like it might be some pirated material, that type of thing, I think.
Which is basically all of BitTorrent.
Yeah,
it's pirated material. Mostly.
The geographic map here just shows a lot of sources in the United States, Brazil, Europe, and when we had analyzed it last week, I didn't do an update on that aspect of it. This is actually last week's map, but I did an eyeball. It looks like it's very consistent still. The other end of the communications were generally in China, so that was a little bit weird. Anyway, I would recommend that if you see this type of activity on your network, to investigate it a little more thoroughly. And if you have any insights into what's going on there, feel free to contact us. We certainly would be interested in your input. And of course, we're not going to mention where you found it, so we'll just take that as an anonymous tip if you like. In the top 10 most probed ports, really no surprises here. There's just a little bit of movement, but actually very little. Top of the list, port 23 TCP. We'll take a little closer look at that. 53413 UDP, we'll take a closer look at that. I didn't actually show or create an additional graphic on port 1900 UDP. This is traditionally the SSDP activity, Simple Service Discovery Protocol, and it's generally associated with reflective denial of service attack activity when you see it on the internet. So there are a couple of spikes here. It was very spiky activity and clearly associated with attack activity, denial of service attack activity, but I'm not certain exactly the circumstances around that, so I chose not to go into a lot of detail here. Followed by port 80 TCP, scanning for those web applications, port 22 TCP, probably not looking for these, you can't scan for clients. You can't scan for clients this way.
No,
you can only scan
really
for servers, right? And port 53 UDP, a lot of, there's been a sort of a rise in reflective denial of service attack activity using DNS. And of course, there's oftentimes scanning for DNS servers anyway. Port 443 TCP, again, the web servers, possibly looking for vulnerable web servers. 445 TCP, we got the configure. And then followed by 1911 TCP. This is actually researchers generally that we've seen. I've seen some other things a little bit sprinkled in here, but predominantly researcher activity. And this is associated with that industrial internet application. Matt, I think you had done a little bit of investigation.
Niagara, that one?
Yeah, I think
it's Tritium Fox,
Tritium Fox.
by Niagara.
Right.
It's interesting. There's a lot of them out there.
A lot of them out there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, if you have any industrial applications,
It's like building
Internet of
automation.
Things, yeah, it's an important, it's important to make sure that those things are tied down pretty tight. Again, it is researchers, but the subsequently, once the researchers gather that data, they actually make it relatively public, and so it's, or in some cases, very public. So it's important that you lock down those systems. It does make that information available to attackers. Looking at port 23, in terms of scan probes, and over the last 90 days, we saw a surge of activity right at the beginning of January that had tapered off as time has gone up, and then there's been a surge in that activity. There was also a little bit of a surge in activity in terms of the sources doing that scanning on port 23. Not a significant one, so but it does sort of attribute or tie back to that surge in terms of the number of probes. Looking at the most sources doing that probing, port 23 clearly at the top of the list, but it's not, a huge proportion of that pie chart in comparison to what we've seen in the past. We've seen it be more than 50% in the not too distant past. So we'll take a little closer look at that. 53413 UDP, we'll take a closer look at that. And the others on here, I guess we'll take a little closer look at 3389 as we go along here as well. Scan sources on port 23 TCP. John, you generated this graph. This is actually the last year of activity, so 365 days. And you can see, we're not near where the peak was from a year ago, but we're still at some pretty substantial numbers here, up in the tens of thousands, actually around 70 to 80,000 sources that are doing scanning activity on port 23 at any given time, doing password guessing or default passwords against these exposed devices. Possibly for next week, we'll bring in, there was an article I saw related to protecting home routers, and there was an assessment done in terms of the security of home routers. And so while that would be perhaps a good thing to discuss here, because that's often the target of a lot of these attacks. Scan sources on port 53413 UDP. This is that netis router backdoor. Again, home router that we were talking about.
The one that I said you could probably write a worm in less than 500 bytes for.
Oh, there you go. You might be able to. That's absolutely true. Good point. Very good point, because it's actually got a scripting language built into the device for you, so it helps you out. The SQL Slammer worm, I'm actually second guessing here. It might not have been 505 bytes. It might have been 404. But it was a number like that. But it was actually done in assembler. It was pretty. Right. It was actually going right into the thing.
You could have a payload that's less than 500 bytes for this, but you'd probably need more than that to go retrieve a secondary. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a possibility.
Anyway.
Yeah. So.
I digress.
You're basically running a wget command and run. Anyway, this is looking at the last 90 days of activity. You can see clearly that there was it just really started activity near the end of November 2015. And then we've seen some very persistent activity since then. So whatever they were looking for, they started to find it. And in fact, there are quite a number of devices out there that are participating in this activity. This is actually looking at the number of sources. And so we're up in the tens, actually around 30 to 35,000 sources that are doing the scanning activity as we look at it now, but it peaked back at the end of November around 60,000 sources. Now, looking at scan sources on port 3389, this is remote desktop protocol, often used for remote access to Windows devices, can be used for Linux devices as well, right? Mm-hmm. Oftentimes associated with password guessing. What we're seeing here is that there's been a pretty steady level of activity in terms of the number of sources scanning here, but we saw basically a surge over the last couple of days, a little bit short of 50% increase in the number of sources there. So it went from about 2,000 sources up to about close to 3,000 sources on average, perhaps a little bit less than that. But nevertheless, a little bit concerning. Somebody else has joined the party, so to speak, in terms of trying to identify these devices, and one that you'll want to be making sure you pay attention to anyway. Of course, 2,000 sources doing scanning all the time is something to pay attention to as well. So that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com. You can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel, on YouTube, as well as iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. So I'd like to thank you, John Markley, online. I keep looking over here because we have a monitor for John, but you're in the camera over there. Thank you for joining us, John Markley, and I appreciate the quiz questions and look forward to doing that again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yep.
Hogaboom. Thank you, John. Geez.
We're all John here. It's okay.
Everybody's a John today, and I'm a Joe. So, no, thank you, Matt, for joining us today. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe, and I'll try to keep my name straight.